The Communication Science and Society Initiative exists to facilitate connections between life scientists and communications scientists. Why do this? Because real-world issues are often bigger than any individual academic discipline. This video is part of our effort to enable understanding across those disciplinary boundaries. In it, we examine the meaning of two phrases that are so similar that confusion is unavoidable: communication science and science communication. What is the difference? To get some perspective on this question, we spoke to Denise Solomon, Distinguished Professor of Communication Arts and Sciences at Penn State University. What is communication science?
So communication science is taking a scientific lens to study the phenomenon of communication.
How is communication science different from science communication?
Science communication, on the other hand, is how we communicate about scientific information. So the goal of science communication is to make complex information that is generated through science more accessible to laypersons and non-experts. So you can see why they would get confused. I mean, really, we're just switching the word order. I find it helpful to think about other kinds of sciences, like material science. We're using scientific principles to understand materials. So communication science is using scientific principles to study the phenomenon of communication. On the other hand, science communication is not a science of, it is instead communication about. So it's communication about scientific information. It's not trying to advance theories about how communication works. It's trying to make accessible science.
To understand the difference between science communication and communication science, let's unpack the assumptions underlying science communication. First, some biological or physical scientific problem has been identified. Let's take, for example, the problem of rising global temperatures and sea levels. Second, that the analysis of the problem is complete, the causes and consequences are known. For example, according to climate scientists, we must reduce carbon emissions if we want to rein in climate change. Finally, that there is a consensus among the biological or physical scientists about the issue and the solutions. That is, science communication assumes that the researchers agree on what the problem is, what causes it, and what needs to be done about it. Science communication also makes assumptions of its audience. There is an assumption that members of the public don't understand the nature of the problem or the solution. The audience suffers from a knowledge deficit. Second, science communication assumes that members of the public have faith in science and trust scientists. Finally, it's assumed that individuals are rational beings in the economic sense. The public is therefore composed of people who act in accordance with their own self-interest. Given these assumptions, science communication takes up the task of educating the public about the problem of climate change in order to fill the knowledge deficit. Problem solved. But, as we all know, that's not how things work out. Although there's an overwhelming consensus on the nature of the problem and the solution now, that wasn't always the case. That uncertainty was exploited by industries whose income streams were threatened by the recommended changes. Faith in science was actively undermined, often by messages that spread virally via social media. Members of the public had a hard time envisioning a threat that initially seemed as if it were far in the future. For all these reasons and more, it became clear that the deficit model of science communication was inadequate. Here's what Denise Solomon has to say about how the deficit model falls short.
A lot of science communication follows a deficit model of communication, which is the assumption that if people just had more information and had the information and could understand the information, they would do the right thing with it. And so the emphasis is on how to convey information. But just take the concrete example of smoking. People know that smoking will kill you. That doesn't mean that they stop smoking. So you can give lots of information about smoking and the risks of smoking, and that doesn't make a smoker stop smoking. So communication science goes further to understand how can we craft messages that have a greater likelihood of, either through the way they are discussed in interpersonal groups, in family settings, in workplaces, in communities, how they have a chance of changing attitudes and behaviors that will mitigate risky behavior, not just inform people about what those behaviors are.
If the deficit model of science communication doesn't work, then what's the alternative? One possibility is communication science. What assumptions does communication science make? Let's look at just a few. First, multiple motives. Self-interest is one motive for action, but there are others of equal importance. Identity, for example, is another. People, for example, often choose their automobile on the basis of what it says about who they are. Emotions also drive behavior. When we are angry, happy, or depressed, we do things we might not do if we felt differently. And we often care a lot about what others think we should or should not do. Second are individual differences. Whereas the deficit model assumes that everyone is pretty much the same, communication science assumes that there are important individual differences across persons. There are Republicans and Democrats, people who have lots of friends, people who have very few, people who believe that climate change is real and others who don't. One of the tasks of communication science is to determine which of these individuals' differences is relevant to behavior change. Third, communication is multifunctional. There are many different reasons that people communicate with one another. Sometimes we try to inform others. That is what science communication is trying to achieve. But people also communicate so as to persuade others, to entertain, to build relationships, to provide advice and emotional support. Science communication is just one function of communication science. Let's listen to Denise Solomon's take on the issue. Are communication science and science communication always mutually exclusive?
They're not. They're different, but they're not. So science communication is, again, communicating information about scientific findings and facts in ways that inform an audience. Sometimes in communication science, we rely on some of those modes of communicating information as part of a persuasion campaign or as part of an education campaign that's intended to change attitudes and behaviors. The difference is that communication science brings what we know about how communication works to bear to help us design persuasion campaigns that don't have adverse effects, don't instigate reactants, don't accidentally, inadvertently stigmatize populations.
To sum up, the deficit model of science communication is a good faith effort to address a real problem, but an examination of its assumptions reveals a number of failings. It's more accurate to view science communication as a subset of communication science, an approach grounded in the application of the scientific method to a broad range of questions and solutions. Thanks for watching. Have a look around our website at cssi.psu.edu to learn more about our current initiatives, and check back for updates on collaborations and upcoming projects.